Big Shaq stepped onto the plane like any other passenger, casual, unassuming. But the flight attendant sized him up, dismissed him, and tried to kick him off. What she didn't know? He wasn't just flying first class. He owned the plane. And when the truth lands, it shakes the entire cabin. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The private jet terminal hummed with quiet efficiency. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp reflections on the polished marble floor. Outside, a sleek midnight black private jet sat on the tarmac, engines low and ready. Inside the jet, Natalie Sterling adjusted her crisp uniform, exhaling sharply as she scanned the boarding list. A fresh hire for Vanguard Aviation, she had worked years to land a position serving the elite. This was where power sat in plush leather seats, sipping aged whiskey at 40,000 feet. She wouldn't let some random guy in a hoodie mess with her first real flight. She turned as the cabin door opened again. A massive figure stepped in, at 7 feet 1 inch, broad-shouldered, and dressed in an oversized hoodie, loose sweats, and worn sneakers. The man barely fit through the doorway. His presence dominated the space without a single word. He moved with the ease of someone who knew his worth but didn't demand recognition. Natalie's brows knit together. She had seen NBA players before, usually flashy, draped in diamonds, reeking of new money and entitlement. This one? He didn't even try to look the part. She cleared her throat, stepping forward. "Sir, passengers need to wait in the lounge. This isn't a commercial flight." The man stopped, blinking down at her. There was no flicker of offense, no hint of defiance, just a slow, amused smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Gotcha. My bad." He nodded once and stepped aside, tucking his massive hands into his hoodie pockets. No argument, no attitude. Natalie's spine stiffened. Something about his reaction annoyed her. He didn't fight back, didn't try to explain, just moved like this happened to him often, like he expected to be dismissed. A low chuckle drifted from the VIP section. Logan Creed, hedge fund billionaire, sat sprawled in his custom leather seat, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He was in his 40s, salt and pepper hair slicked back, wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's mortgages. Hope they're not just letting anyone on board these days. His smirk was sharp, full of casual cruelty. Natalie felt her shoulders relax. Finally, someone who understood the standards of exclusivity. The giant in the hoodie turned his head slightly. "Gotta be careful. Some people own the whole damn sky." His tone was light, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, just something steady. Captain Reynolds, a veteran pilot with years of experience flying real power, observed from the cockpit door. He recognized the tension immediately and chose to stay quiet. He had seen situations like this too many times. Natalie turned back to her passenger list, scanning the names. The guest manifest was confidential, but she knew for certain this guy wasn't on it. She pressed her lips together, glancing at the co-pilot, Mason Tate, who suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Mason hesitated before murmuring, "Just be careful." "Careful?" Natalie scoffed. "Of what? Some washed-up ex-basketball player trying to sneak onto a flight?" Mason just shook his head. The tension in the cabin thickened as Shaq moved toward the rear of the plane, clearly waiting. His expression stayed calm, unreadable. Natalie squared her shoulders. This was her flight, her rules. She strode after him. "Sir, this is a private charter. If you're looking for a commercial flight, the main terminal is—" A slow chuckle from the co-pilot's chair cut her off. She turned sharply to see Captain Reynolds shaking his head. The old pilot's lips twitched, like he was watching something unfold that he had seen before. "What?" she snapped. Reynolds leaned against the doorframe. "Nothing." Logan Creed, still sipping his drink, smirked. He won't argue. They never do. Natalie glanced back at Shaq. He hadn't moved, hadn't protested, hadn't corrected her. Instead, he looked disinterested, like he was waiting to see just how far this would go. Reynolds sighed and turned toward his controls. "Well, let's see how long this takes." Natalie stiffened. "What the hell does that mean?" No one answered. Instead, Shaq chuckled again, low, deep, and knowing. And then he took a seat. Not in the back, not in a side chair. In the main VIP seat. Natalie felt her stomach tighten. Something was very wrong. She turned to Logan, expecting his usual arrogance, but even he looked uncomfortable now. A creeping feeling settled into her gut. She slowly faced Mason. "Who is he?" she whispered. Mason swallowed, glancing at Shaq, then at the cockpit. He ran a hand over his face and sighed. "You just tried to kick the owner of the plane off his own flight." Silence. Natalie's ears rang. Shaq leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, completely at ease. Natalie's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The air in the cabin shifted. Passengers, sensing the weight of the moment, suddenly became very, very quiet. Logan's smirk vanished. His drink remained untouched. Captain Reynolds gave a short, knowing exhale. And Shaq? He just smiled. Not smug, not vengeful. Just waiting. Like he had been here before. Like he knew exactly how this was going to go. And he was in no rush to stop it. Shaq leaned back in his seat, one massive arm draped over the armrest, his fingers tapping lightly against the smooth leather. The silence in the cabin stretched, thick and unspoken, but he was in no rush to fill it. He had seen this kind of moment play out before, the realization creeping in, the weight of mistakes settling on people's faces. He had spent a lifetime watching people judge first and understand later. His gaze flickered toward Natalie, who stood stiffly near the aisle, still processing what she had just learned. She avoided eye contact now, her confidence cracking at the edges. Across the aisle, Logan Creed swirled his drink slowly, his usual arrogance curdling into quiet tension. Captain Reynolds and co-pilot Mason sat in the cockpit, exchanging glances but saying nothing. Shaq exhaled through his nose, his mind drifting, not back to anger, because anger was easy, but to something deeper. He had been here before. The first time he realized the world didn't see him the way he saw himself, he was just a kid, standing at the counter of a convenience store in Newark. His mother, Lucille O'Neill, had sent him in with a crumpled bill to grab a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread. He had walked in, a tall, lanky 11-year-old, barely able to keep his shoelaces tied. The cashier had watched him too closely. Shaq hadn't understood at first. He had been polite, said yes ma'am, and thank you like his mother taught him. But when he placed the milk and bread on the counter, the woman didn't take his money. She folded her arms instead. "Where'd you get that bill?" she had asked, suspicion lacing her voice. Shaq had frowned, glancing at the money. "My mama gave it to me." The cashier's lips pursed. "I don't think so. She didn't take his money, didn't ring him up. Just stood there watching, waiting for him to trip over a lie that didn't exist." It wasn't until another customer, a white man in a suit, stepped forward and gave the woman a look that she finally snatched the bill from Shaq's hand and rang up the items. She had tossed the change on the counter instead of placing it in his palm. Shaq had walked home confused, his small hands gripping the grocery bag tightly. He had repeated the story to his mother as she unpacked the items. Lucille had gone still. Then, in that quiet, powerful voice of hers, she had said, "Baby, some people gon' decide who you are before you even open your mouth. But that don't mean you gotta prove 'em right." That night, she had sat him down and told him something he never forgot. "Humility is power, Shaquille. Never let 'em tell you different." Years later, when college scouts came knocking, he carried those words with him. When coaches yelled, telling him he was too big, too slow, he listened. When they said he'd never be more than a big guy who could dunk, he learned to pass, to play defense, to think 2 moves ahead. When reporters questioned his intelligence, assuming he was all brawn and no brain, he earned a degree, then another, and another. And when he finally stood on that stage, drafted into the NBA, with the cameras flashing and the world watching, he remembered that 11-year-old kid holding a gallon of milk. He could have been arrogant, could have thrown the weight of his success in people's faces, but instead, he smiled. He thanked. He stayed humble. Because humility was power. And that was a lesson the world never expected him to learn. Back in the jet, Shaq let his eyes drift across the cabin, watching. Natalie had regained some composure, but her movements were smaller now, careful. He could feel the shift in her, the slow unraveling of assumptions, the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, she had made a mistake bigger than she could fix with an apology. She moved toward another passenger, a well-dressed man in his 60s, silver cufflinks flashing as he adjusted his newspaper. Her voice was smoother now, more deliberate. She wasn't rushing past people anymore. Shaq had seen that before too. People learned fast when they got caught. But real change, that took longer. He turned his head slightly, catching the way Logan Creed's grip tightened around his glass. That one wasn't learning. Not yet. Shaq knew his type. The ones who believed power was in money and connections, in sitting first class and looking down on the people who weren't. They never thought about the real weight of power. Shaq had met men richer than Logan Creed. Men who owned teams, networks, entire empires. He had shaken hands with billionaires, had dined with kings and presidents. But the strongest people he had ever met? The janitor who raised 5 kids alone. The single mother who worked 2 jobs and still made it to church every Sunday. The old man who ran a diner and gave free meals to anyone who needed one. Power wasn't in money. It was in who you were when no one was watching. And right now, Shaq was watching. Natalie moved toward the galley, pressing her lips together, probably replaying every word she had said to him. Good. Not because he wanted her to feel bad, but because he wanted her to think. Across the aisle, Logan exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. So, Logan said suddenly, leaning back in his seat, are you going to give us a speech about privilege now? Or are we all just supposed to sit here and feel guilty? Shaq chuckled lowly, shaking his head. Man, I don't care what you feel. Logan's jaw tightened. Shaq stretched his legs out, completely at ease. But I do know one thing. People like you? He glanced at Logan's custom suit, his polished cufflinks, the silent challenge in his eyes. You're real brave when you think you're the richest man in the room. Logan's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. Shaq turned his attention back to the window, watching as the tarmac disappeared beneath them. Humility is power. And right now, he had all of it. The air inside the cabin had changed. It was subtle, but Shaq could feel it. The way conversations had slowed, the way Natalie's once confident posture had stiffened, the way even the hum of the jet engines seemed quieter now, like the plane itself was holding its breath. Natalie was avoiding his eyes. That was expected. She had realized her mistake, and now she was overcorrecting, directing all of her energy elsewhere, specifically toward Logan Creed. Shaq had seen people like Logan before, wealthy, entitled, draped in the kind of arrogance that came from knowing the world had always bent in their favor. Logan wasn't just rich, he was the kind of rich that made sure people knew it. Natalie, flustered from her earlier misstep, seemed to gravitate toward him now, almost like she needed a reminder of where her priorities should be. She was attentive, leaning in when he spoke, smiling at his offhand remarks, offering him top-shelf whiskey before even acknowledging the other passengers. Shaq watched with quiet amusement as she placed a hand-stitched cloth napkin on the tray in front of Logan, as if she were serving royalty. Mr. Creed, can I get you anything else? Her tone was lighter now, more eager, as if she had to make up for something. Logan took his time before answering. He adjusted his cufflinks, shifted slightly in his leather seat, and let the pause stretch long enough to make it clear that he enjoyed this little display of power. Finally, he lifted his glass slightly. This'll do. For now. Shaq hid his smirk, shaking his head just slightly. Natalie, catching the movement, tensed. She turned sharply. Something funny? Shaq leaned back, his massive frame effortlessly taking up space, but his face remained calm. Not funny. Just familiar. Logan let out a short, clipped laugh. Familiar, huh? He tilted his head slightly, studying Shaq the way a predator studies an animal outside its cage. Yeah, I bet you see a lot of this kind of thing. What do they call it? First-class treatment? Shaq didn't blink. He knew where this was going. Logan smirked. Hope they don't let just anyone on board these days. A loaded silence followed. Natalie's lips twitched slightly, almost like she wanted to smile but knew better. Shaq could have let it slide, Could have done what he always did, let them talk, let them assume. But today, something about Logan's smug face, Natalie's half smirk, the entire power dynamic at play just made him feel like reminding them. So he did. Gotta be careful, he said, exhaling smoothly. Some people own the whole damn sky. Logan's smirk faltered, just slightly. But Shaq caught it. Natalie did too. She tilted her head, studying him now, like something wasn't quite adding up. She was trying to place him, trying to figure out why his confidence didn't match the assumptions she had made earlier. In the cockpit, Mason Tate shifted uncomfortably. He had been quiet for most of the exchange, but now his knuckles were white against the armrest. He knew. Shaq saw it in his posture, the way his eyes flickered from Logan to Natalie to Shaq, and then back to his instruments, like he didn't want to be part of whatever was happening in the cabin. But Logan? Logan wasn't done. Huh. Logan leaned forward slightly, swirling his drink. You talk like a man who thinks he knows something the rest of us don't. Shaq chuckled. I know a lot of things. Logan grinned. I bet you do. He turned slightly as if making conversation, but still very much trying to establish dominance. What do you do, big guy? Natalie perked up. She was listening carefully now, really listening. Shaq shrugged. I keep busy. Logan chuckled, like that answer confirmed what he already assumed. Right. Hustling, grinding, that sort of thing. Shaq nodded, playing along. Something like that. He could have ended it there, could have let Logan believe whatever he wanted. But Logan wasn't satisfied. See, I recognize your type, Logan continued, stretching one arm along the back of his seat. Big guy like you, probably used to getting what you want. People hyping you up, telling you you're the man. Then one day reality hits. You realize the real power? That stays with people like me. Shaq's smile didn't fade. People like you. Logan nodded. The ones who build things, own things. He gestured around the jet, as if emphasizing his world, his playing field. The ones who actually run things. Natalie stayed silent. Mason's grip on the controls tightened. Shaq exhaled slowly. He thought about all the contracts he had signed, the teams he had played for, the businesses he had built, the investments, the properties, the companies. He thought about how men like Logan assumed power was measured in private jets and expensive whiskey. And then he thought about who actually signed Logan Creed's paychecks. So he leaned forward, just slightly. You ever fly commercial, Logan? Shaq's voice was light, but there was something beneath it. Something weighted. Logan blinked, caught off guard. Hell no. Shaq nodded like that was exactly the answer he expected. That's funny. Logan frowned. What's funny? Shaq's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. I own stock in 5 major airlines. He let that sink in for a second, then added, so technically, every time you book a flight, you're putting money in my pocket. Logan went still. Natalie's mouth parted slightly. Mason let out a slow, silent breath. Shaq didn't blink, didn't break eye contact, didn't even raise his voice, just smiled, and let the weight of his words settle. Logan shifted in his seat. His drink, once swirling confidently, was now sitting untouched in his hand. For the first time since they had boarded, he had nothing to say. Natalie, still reeling, turned away quickly and busied herself with adjusting trays that didn't need adjusting. Mason, in the cockpit, stared straight ahead, gripping the controls like he didn't want to be involved. The jet continued its smooth ascent. And Shaq? Shaq leaned back again, arms crossed, relaxed, because he didn't have to prove a damn thing. Natalie's pulse pounded in her ears as she tightened her grip on the clipboard. The weight of her earlier mistake sat heavily on her chest, but she couldn't afford to let it shake her now. Control the situation, reinforce authority. That's what she had been trained to do. But something about this whole interaction felt off. She had spent years working on flights that carried the world's most powerful, most untouchable people. CEOs, politicians, celebrities, real power. Yet the way this man, this massive, calm, unreadable man, sat there without reacting, without trying to prove himself, without defending his place on this jet, made her uneasy. The rich ones always barked back. The famous ones made a scene, but he just sat there. And that silence? It was louder than anything. Natalie squared her shoulders. Do your job. Handle this. She turned toward the co-pilot's seat. Mason, confirm his name on the manifest. Mason didn't move. His fingers were locked on the armrest, knuckles pale, lips pressed together like he was debating whether to speak. Mason. Her voice sharpened. Still, no response. Her stomach tightened. That was the first sign that something wasn't right. Then came the second. A low chuckle. Smooth, unbothered. Shaq, still leaning back, still impossibly relaxed, exhaled slowly. You sure you want to do this? His voice wasn't threatening. It wasn't angry. It was a warning. And it landed heavier than if he'd yelled. Natalie's skin prickled. Logan, who had been watching with mild amusement, suddenly sat up straighter. He saw an opportunity. These guys always think rules don't apply. His voice was edged with something just a little too eager, a little too entertained. Shaq turned his head slightly, meeting Logan's gaze. Natalie saw it, the barely perceptible shift in Logan's expression. A flicker of hesitation. Shaq didn't need to raise his voice to dominate a room. His presence was enough. Captain Reynolds, who had been silent up until now, suddenly moved. He let out a slow breath, adjusted his headset, and finally turned toward Natalie. She expected him to back her up, to support her authority, to confirm that this man wasn't supposed to be here. Instead, he hesitated. A muscle in his jaw ticked. Then, after an unbearably long pause, he said, Sterling, maybe just take a second. Natalie felt her stomach drop. The tone, the hesitation. The way Mason refused to look up from the controls. She wasn't in control of this situation anymore. And worse, she had never been. Logan scoffed. What's the holdup? Either he's supposed to be here, or he's not. Shaq finally moved. Slowly, purposefully, he sat forward. The motion was deceptively simple, but it commanded attention. Natalie instinctively took half a step back, and the instant she did, she hated herself for it. She was losing ground. Shaq rested his forearms on his knees, his massive hands clasped together. His gaze flicked between Natalie and Logan. Then, finally, he spoke. You ever been underestimated? His voice was smooth, steady, but there was something beneath it. Natalie swallowed. Excuse me? Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying her. You ever been in a room full of people who already decided who you are before you even opened your mouth? Her pulse skipped. Because she had. So had Mason. So had Captain Reynolds. Even Logan, though his version of it was different. Shaq leaned back again, letting his words settle. That's where we are right now. Logan scoffed. Oh, please. No one's oppressing you, big guy. You're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Shaq's lips twitched, but it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. Natalie exhaled sharply, trying to regain control of the conversation. Look, Mr. She hesitated. She didn't know his last name. That realization made her chest tighten. Shaq caught it. Of course he did. His voice dropped slightly, quieter but heavier. Go ahead. Say my name. Natalie felt a bead of sweat at her temple. Mason looked like he was begging the universe to disappear. Logan, oblivious, rolled his eyes. Oh, for God's sake, this is ridiculous. Just tell them who you are so we can all move on. Shaq's expression didn't change. You first. Logan froze. Natalie's breath caught. Because that was it. That was the moment. Shaq wasn't hiding his identity. He was testing them, making them say it, making them admit that they already knew. And that's when Natalie realized. Logan did. Maybe not at first. Maybe not when he had made his smug little comments. But now. Now he knew exactly who was sitting across from him. And for the first time since the flight started, he didn't look entertained anymore. Shaq didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just watched. And waited. Logan swallowed. His grip on his whiskey glass tightened. Natalie's hands felt clammy around her clipboard. She had spent the last hour treating the owner of the plane like he didn't belong on it. Shaq exhaled, slow and controlled, then finally said, "Yeah, that's what I thought." Natalie's entire world tilted. She had been wrong. So wrong. And she didn't even have the words to fix it. Captain Reynolds leaned against the cockpit doorframe, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. Mason looked ready to crawl out of his own skin. And Logan. Logan looked like he had just realized he wasn't the most powerful man on the plane. Shaq stretched slightly, then turned his gaze back to Natalie. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. And somehow that was worse. Natalie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She had no idea what to say. No idea how to fix what she had just done. Shaq shook his head, then leaned back into his seat, like he had already moved on. The conversation was over. But the consequences? They were just beginning. Silence. Thick, suffocating silence filled the cabin. Natalie's breathing felt uneven. The clipboard in her hands was useless now, just dead weight pressing into her palms. The air felt too hot, too thin, like the plane had lost altitude without anyone noticing. She had heard the words, but she couldn't process them. "Ma'am," Captain Reynolds had said it so plainly, so effortlessly, as if it weren't about to shatter her entire reality. "He owns this plane." The words still hung there, suspended in the air, crushing her. Owns it? Number. That wasn't possible. That wasn't how the world worked. People like him didn't own things like this. She tried to form words, but nothing came. Across the cabin, Logan Creed had gone completely still. The amusement that had danced behind his eyes just minutes ago? Gone. The arrogant smirk that had seemed permanently fixed to his face? Nowhere to be found. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed. Shaq, meanwhile, did nothing. No gloating, no smug expression. He simply sat there, leaning back in his seat, arms crossed, eyes calm, just waiting. Natalie felt her entire body lock up. She had mocked him, dismissed him, almost thrown him off his own plane. A wave of nausea crawled up her throat. She had spent the entire flight bending over backward for Logan Creed, treating him like a king while trying to push out the man who owned the damn sky. Her hands shook. Her knees felt weak. And the worst part? The way Shaq was watching her now, not with anger, not with arrogance, just with understanding. Like he had seen this happen before, like he had expected it, and somehow that was so much worse. Logan shifted in his seat, his throat bobbing with a hard swallow. He opened his mouth, probably to smooth things over, to laugh it off, to regain control of the situation. But nothing came out, because there was nothing to say. Natalie looked at Captain Reynolds, begging for some kind of intervention. But Reynolds? He just sighed and rubbed his temple, like a man who had seen this play out one too many times. Mason, the co-pilot, looked pale, uneasy, desperate to be anywhere else. Natalie's stomach churned. She had messed up. Not just a little. Not just something she could fix with an apology. This was bad. The kind of mistake that followed you forever. The kind that changed you. Shaq exhaled slowly, the only sound breaking the thick, humiliating silence. Then finally he spoke. "Guess you learn something new every day." He said it with a shake of his head, almost amused. Almost like he was disappointed but not surprised. Natalie's face burned. Because the way he said it was so damn gracious. If he had yelled, if he had thrown his weight around, if he had demanded she be removed from the flight, it would have been easier. She could have rationalized that. But this was worse. Because he wasn't mad. He was just tired. Like a man who had been through this exact situation more times than he could count. A faint cough from the back of the plane broke the silence. Some other passenger suddenly very interested in the exchange. Eyes darted between them. The passengers, the crew, everyone was watching. Natalie felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her skin. Her mind raced for a way out, for a way to undo what had just happened. But there wasn't one, and she knew it. Logan, ever the opportunist, cleared his throat and tried to recover. "Well, damn. That's..." He forced out a chuckle, but it died halfway through. He glanced around for support, but no one met his eyes, not even Natalie. For the first time since the flight started, Logan Creed had no power. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his massive frame still impossibly calm. His deep voice, smooth and controlled, filled the cabin like gravity itself. You ever hear the phrase, never assume? Natalie swallowed hard. She had. She just never thought she'd be the one to learn the lesson. Shaq tilted his head slightly. You know what's funny? I could have told you who I was from the jump. I could have corrected you when you dismissed me. Could have flexed, made a scene. But I didn't. You know why? Natalie's throat went dry. Shaq's voice was steady, but there was weight behind it. Because I wanted to see how far you'd go. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Natalie's stomach twisted, because she knew exactly how far she had gone, and she hated herself for it. The realization hit her like a freight train. She hadn't just misjudged a man. She had proven herself to be exactly the kind of person she swore she wasn't. And Shaq? Shaq had known the whole time. She wanted to apologize. But what was she supposed to say? I didn't know? It was a mistake? None of that would erase what she had done. None of it would change the way she had looked at him before she knew who he was. Shaq leaned back, exhaling like the moment had already passed for him, like this was just another day. And maybe, for him, it was. That realization made her want to crawl out of her own skin. Logan, clearly uncomfortable with his own sudden lack of importance, shifted in his seat and reached for his drink. His hands weren't as steady as before. The tension in the cabin still hung thick. Passengers stole glances, whispering behind hands, processing the shift in power. Shaq, unbothered, glanced at his watch, like he had all the time in the world. Natalie wanted to melt into the floor. Her job was to serve people like him, and she had treated him like he didn't belong. And worst of all, he had given her every chance to do the right thing, and she hadn't. Her mouth opened slightly, but before she could force out an apology, Shaq did something that caught her completely off guard. He smiled. It wasn't smug, it wasn't mocking, it was kind. And that was the final nail in the coffin. Because she didn't deserve his kindness, she didn't deserve his patience, but he had given it to her anyway. And now, she had to live with that. Natalie's mouth felt dry, her throat tight. The weight of everything she had just done sat heavy on her chest, crushing the air from her lungs. Her fingers clenched around the edge of her clipboard, though she barely registered holding it anymore. The silence stretched, suffocating. Everyone was watching. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some pretended not to listen, while others stole open stares, captivated by the sheer weight of what had just unfolded. She needed to say something, anything. She swallowed hard and forced her lips to move. I didn't know. I assumed. Her voice barely carried over the cabin noise. Shaq, still leaning back, his massive arms crossed over his chest, gave her a long, slow nod. Yeah. His voice was deep, steady, but there was an edge to it now. You did. Natalie's stomach twisted. She expected anger. She expected humiliation. But this was so much worse. Shaq wasn't yelling. He wasn't rubbing it in her face. He was just telling the truth. And she had to sit there and face it. Across the cabin, Logan Creed's irritation boiled over. He let out a sharp, frustrated laugh, shaking his head. Oh, come on, this is ridiculous. Shaq's eyes flicked to him, but he didn't speak. Logan turned to the crew, looking for support. She's just doing her job. Some people act entitled, you know, always looking for special treatment. And what, now she's the bad guy for following protocol? Natalie flinched. She knew exactly what Logan was doing. He wasn't defending her. He was protecting himself, spinning the narrative, trying to shift the blame before he got swallowed by it too. Shaq exhaled, slow and controlled. His eyes darkened, not in anger, but in something deeper. This wasn't just about him anymore. Natalie felt a sharp pull in her chest, because suddenly, this wasn't about her either. It was about every time someone had been dismissed. Every time someone had been told they didn't belong. And Logan? He was exactly the kind of person who never had to question his place. The The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut. Logan wasn't done. He scoffed, shaking his head. I mean, what were you expecting? You walk onto a plane like this, dressed like that, and you think people are just going to assume you belong? Captain Reynolds pinched the bridge of his nose. Co-pilot Mason shifted uncomfortably. Natalie wanted to disappear. Because even though Logan's words weren't directed at her, they still felt like a slap to the face. She had thought the same thing, hadn't she? Hadn't she sized up Shaq the moment he stepped onto the plane? Hadn't she dismissed him, written him off without a second thought? And now? Now she was watching Logan do it right in front of her, and she hated it. Shaq's voice cut through the cabin like steel. You really want to do this, Logan? Logan forced a laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. Shaq uncrossed his arms, finally sitting forward, his full attention on Logan now. The air shifted. Natalie could feel it. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. You think I care how you see me? His tone was smooth, but there was an undeniable weight behind it. You think I need your approval to exist in a space I already own? Logan's smirk faltered. Shaq let the words hang there for a beat. Then, he turned to Natalie. His gaze was steady, unshaken. Mistakes are accidents. He spoke slowly, deliberately. What you did? That was a choice. Natalie felt those words hit her like a gut punch. She thought back to every moment in that flight, every second she had dismissed Shaq, every glance, every hesitation, every choice. She couldn't hide from it. Shaq wasn't mad. He wasn't asking for an apology. He was just holding up a mirror. And what she saw in it? She didn't like it. Co-pilot Mason, who had been quiet the entire time, finally cleared his throat. We all make mistakes, he murmured, like he wanted to cut the tension before it crushed the whole damn cabin. Shaq didn't break his gaze from Natalie. Yeah, he said. We do. But the question is, what do you do after? Natalie's breath shuddered, because she knew in that moment this conversation wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cabin felt different now. The tension had shifted. Not gone, but transformed into something heavier, something unspoken but deeply felt. Natalie stood stiffly, her hands clenched at her sides. She was still reeling, still processing what had just happened, but the weight of Shaq's words pressed down on her like a storm cloud she couldn't escape. Across from her, Logan Creed still held onto his arrogance, but it was beginning to crack. He sat rigid, his drink untouched, his once amused expression replaced by something colder, harder. Shaq, meanwhile, remained steady. He wasn't rattled, wasn't angry. He had been through this before. That much was clear. He exhaled slowly and broke the silence. You know. His voice was deep, deliberate, filling the space effortlessly. This ain't new to me. Natalie's throat tightened. Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. His fingers interlocked, his presence calm, but commanding. I've been turned away from stores I could buy. His voice was even, matter of fact. Ignored in hotels I own. Passed over, dismissed, just like today. Natalie felt something twist inside her. She wanted to look away, to detach herself from the truth of his words, but she couldn't. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze moving between her and Logan. You know the funny thing? He let the question linger. I've never judged anyone the way you both judged me today. Logan let out a sharp breath, scoffing. Oh, come on. Shaq didn't react. Natalie did. The burn in her chest deepened. She blinked quickly, realizing her vision was starting to blur, not out of fear, out of realization. Because Shaq wasn't just talking about today. He was talking about every day, every interaction, every dismissal, every assumption, and she had just become another name on that long list. Logan, sensing the shift, clung to his defiance. He rolled his eyes, forcing out a dry laugh. So what? You're rich. You can do whatever you want. It's not the same. Shaq's expression didn't change. If anything, his smile grew sharper. You're right. He nodded, slow and deliberate. It's worse. Logan's smirk faltered. Shaq let the weight of his words settle, then he drove it home. 'Cause money can't change how people see you. Silence. A deep, undeniable silence. Natalie felt it deep in her bones. She had spent her whole life thinking money was the great equalizer, that once you had enough of it, doors opened, barriers fell. But now she saw the truth. For some people, the rules never change. She saw it in Shaq's steady gaze. She saw it in the way Logan had nothing to say. She saw it in herself. The woman she thought she was, fair, professional, unbiased, had just been shattered, because today she hadn't judged a man by his character. She had judged him by everything else, and now she had to live with that. The plane descended smoothly, the soft hum of the engines the only sound filling the cabin. But inside, no one felt steady. Natalie's stomach twisted as she gripped the seat beside her for balance, but it wasn't the descent making her feel this way. It was everything else, everything she had done, everything she had realized too late. Outside the window, the runway stretched out beneath them, lights flickering against the fading sky. The landing gear thudded softly into place. The cabin shifted as the wheels kissed the ground, the aircraft slowing with effortless grace. The flight was over, but the moment that had changed her, that would stay. She swallowed against the lump in her throat, fingers clenched tight against her palm. She had been on hundreds of flights, had greeted countless passengers, but never, not once, had she felt the way she did right now. She had been wrong, and not just wrong, deeply, fundamentally mistaken. The wheels rolled along the tarmac, the plane slowing to a near stop. The air inside remained thick, heavy with the weight of what had happened. Passengers stirred, seatbelts clicked. A few shifted awkwardly, glancing between Shaq and Natalie, waiting to see what would happen next. Natalie's breath was shaky. She had to say something. She had to own this. It didn't matter that Logan had been worse. It didn't matter that she had been caught up in his arrogance and influence. She had made her own choices. And now, she had to face them. Her feet felt unsteady as she stepped forward, breaking the professional distance she had been trained to maintain. Passengers stopped mid-motion, watching. Logan, still stiff and silent, shifted in his seat, as if he wanted to distance himself from whatever was about to happen. But this wasn't about him anymore. Natalie forced herself to stand tall, even as her heart pounded. She stopped in front of Shaq. His expression was unreadable. Calm, patient, waiting. She took a breath. "Mr. O'Neill, She hesitated, voice catching. She had practiced apologies before. She had used every variation of "I'm sorry" in professional settings, but none of those felt right now, because this wasn't a corporate mistake. This was personal. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I was wrong." The words felt heavy, but true. "I treated you differently, and I'm sorry." The air inside the plane felt still. Shaq studied her, his dark eyes steady, searching. Natalie felt exposed, like she was being measured, not for her words, but for her sincerity. A long pause stretched between them. Then, finally, Shaq nodded. "You don't owe me an apology." His voice was smooth, quiet, but carried weight. Natalie's breath hitched. He was letting her off the hook? But then, he added, "Just don't do it again. To anyone." The words hit harder than any reprimand ever could. Because this wasn't about him. It wasn't about fixing things between them. It was about who she chose to be after this. Natalie nodded, her throat tight, her chest aching with the weight of the lesson she had learned. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was a reality check. And she wouldn't ignore it. The cabin door swung open, letting in the cool, pressurized air of the aircraft. Natalie smoothed out her uniform, adjusting the gold wings pinned to her chest. The badge felt heavier now. She had been on countless flights since that day with Shaquille O'Neal, but none had left a mark quite like that one. It stayed with her, the way she had judged him, the way he had never needed to prove himself, because he already knew exactly who he was. And most of all, the way he had left her with a truth she couldn't shake. Just don't do it again. To anyone. That wasn't a lesson about him. It was a lesson about her. And now she was making sure she never forgot it. She turned as an elderly man in a simple gray suit stepped onto the plane. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his worn leather briefcase into the overhead bin. He moved slowly, cautiously, like he was used to being overlooked, used to people brushing past him without notice. Natalie watched as another flight attendant, younger and eager, impatiently waited for him to finish. She saw it happen before it even did. The subtle shift in body language, the faint irritation in the attendant's eyes, the way people assumed who was worth extra kindness and who wasn't. Before the moment could slip into something ugly, Natalie stepped in. She reached up, steadying the man's suitcase with an easy smile. "Take your time, sir. No rush." The older man looked up, surprised. His eyes crinkled at the corners, warmth spreading across his face. "Thank you, dear." His voice was soft, but filled with something more, something grateful. Because he had felt it too. The judgment, the impatience. But not this time. Not from her. Natalie gave him a small nod, then moved down the aisle, her chest feeling lighter than it had in weeks. This question mark. This was how it started. Not grand gestures, not big speeches. Just one moment at a time. The bright glare of a television screen flickered inside a sleek airport lounge. News anchors spoke in smooth, rehearsed voices as financial updates scrolled along the bottom of the screen. Natalie barely noticed any of it, until a familiar face flashed across the screen. She stopped mid-step, tray still in her hands, eyes locking onto the headline. Shaquille O'Neal announces donation to fund new shelter for underprivileged children. Her breath caught. The footage cut to Shaq standing outside a newly renovated building. A group of kids crowded around him, their faces lit with excitement, their laughter filling the space. One of the reporters asked, "Why this project? Why now?" Shaq smiled, that same quiet, powerful expression he had worn on the plane. "Because everybody deserves to be seen." Natalie felt something shift inside her. She had met millionaires before. She had served powerful men, celebrities, CEOs, but none of them were like him. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just rich. He was something more. And she had almost missed it. She let out a slow breath, a smile pulling at her lips as the segment ended. He had changed the world in so many ways. And in one small, quiet moment, he had changed her too. Shaq stepped through the doors of a high-end restaurant, the scent of seared steak and aged wine filling the air. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly tied-back hair and a rehearsed smile, glanced up as he walked in. Her eyes flicked to his clothes. Casual. Simple. A split second passed. Shaq recognized the hesitation. It was the same hesitation he had seen 1,000 times before. He watched her wrestle with the thought. Does he belong here? The question flickered in her eyes, almost imperceptible. Almost. She straightened, hesitating for just a beat too long. Shaq waited. Would she make the same mistake, or had the world changed even just a little? Then, she smiled. "Right this way, sir." No second glance, no assumptions. Just respect. Shaq grinned, stepping forward. Maybe the world was changing. One moment at a time. Perception is powerful. Assumptions are dangerous. How many times have you judged too quickly, looked but never really seen? The next time you step into a room, a conversation, a moment, ask yourself, who am I overlooking? Because true power isn't in wealth or status. It's in knowing when to pause and see people for who they really are.